Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. We're just letting folks join. Nice to see you all. Thanks for joining us today. As folks are starting to log on, we'll go and get started. Welcome to the IIP's monthly webinar, Taking Stock, Prosecution, Prevention, and New Responses to Retail Theft. I'm Rachel Marshall, the Executive Director of the IIP, and as many of you know, we host these monthly webinars to provide education, strategies, and insight for prosecutors and stakeholders in improving their approaches to public safety. The IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. Today's topic is one that we're really excited about because we know there's been so much interest in this issue because this decade in the 2020s, retail theft offenses have been one of the highest profile kinds of offenses that we hear about. And we hear a lot of cities talking about their struggles with retail thefts and its impact on quality of life. Retail theft crimes can lead to a sense of disorder for communities and consumers, and business leaders often complain about reported thefts and reported lack of consequences for frequent offenses. But today we want to dive a little bit deeper than just the headlines and really think about what does the data say about these crimes? Have they been on the rise since 2020? What drives these kinds of offenses and what actually works at addressing them? What approaches should prosecutors adopt to respond to these crimes effectively and better serve their communities rather than just resorting to strategies that we know have not been successful in the past? Today's discussion will explore innovative ways that prosecutors can address shoplifting and retail theft without resorting to punitive measures. And we'll also discuss how prosecutors can navigate their relationships with the business community and how to ensure that public safety, rather than private interests, drive criminal justice responses. I'm really excited about our panelists today who all bring really interesting perspectives and experiences on this issue from across the country. And for the sake of time, I will very briefly introduce them, even though they have very lengthy and extensive bios, but we will link to those lengthy and extensive bios in the chat momentarily. I'm going to start with my former boss, Chesa Boudin, who is the founding executive director of Berkeley's Criminal Law and Justice Center and National Policy and Advocacy Hub. He served as San Francisco's elected district attorney from 2020 until 2022 and had many, many achievements in office, including a significant expansion of the office's Victim Services Division, eliminating the prosecutor's use of money bail, prosecuting police for excessive force in historic ways, suing the manufacturers of ghost guns, expanding diversion to address root causes of crime, and an historic reduction in incarceration. And very critically, during his time in office, both violent and nonviolent crime fell by double digits. A lot more accomplishments as well. I encourage you all to check out his full bio. Another very accomplished former prosecutor with us today is Kim Fox, who served as the first Black woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the nation. Kim took office in 2016, was elected resoundingly to a second term in 2020. As Cook County State's Attorney, Kim undertook substantial criminal justice reforms focused on public safety and equity. Among her many achievements were addressing the harms of the money bond system as she instructed her prosecutors to agree to recognizance bonds where appropriate and reviewing bond decisions in cases where people were detained because they could not afford bonds of $1,000 or less. Her efforts went beyond her office and culminated with the passage of the Pretrial Fairness Act in 2021 in Illinois, which was historic legislation that made Illinois the first state in the nation to abolish cash bail altogether. Relevant for today's discussion, she also raised the threshold on felony retail theft to $1,000 in alignment with other major jurisdictions in the country, and I know she'll be talking about that as well. Welcome, Kim. We're so delighted to have you.
Yeah.
Next, welcome to Mark Levin, who's the Chief Policy Counsel for the Council on Criminal Justice, where he co-leads the Centering Justice Initiative and helped develop landmark bipartisan principles on criminal justice policy embraced by 14 leading organizations on both the left and right. He began the Texas Public Policy Foundation's criminal justice program in 2005, and building on that success, he developed the concept for the Right on Crime initiative in 2010. Mark has authored hundreds of publications and articles on criminal justice policy and has testified before Congress on numerous occasions, as well as before legislatures in states including Texas, Nevada, Kansas, Wisconsin, and California. Welcome, Mark. We're happy to have you. And last but certainly not least, we are so delighted to welcome Barbara Stave, who's the Director of Communications for the National Association for Shoplifting Prevention, a nonprofit organization providing education, advocacy, and shoplifting prevention and education programs for the court systems, retailers, and the wider community since 1989. She has maintained a focus on building consensus in the retail industry and the criminal and juvenile justice communities around the issue of shoplifting and its broader implications for our society, economy, and youth. Barbara's also a champion of the retail loss prevention and asset prevention protection community and a longtime proponent of innovative and collaborative strategies that reduce shoplifter recidivism, address organized retail theft challenges, and improve community safety, all while still serving all stakeholders in the shoplifting issue equally, from the retail asset protection and criminal justice communities to the shoplifting offenders themselves. We're really excited to have all of you, and Barbara, we're so excited to have your perspective with us today. I really want to thank all of you for making the time to be with us after a long holiday weekend. Um, I want to get started, Chesa, with you. There's a narrative that we had heard, particularly coming out of San Francisco since 2020, but also across the country as well, that shoplifters these days are just very brazen, that there's these high profile incidents of smash and grabs, and we've seen a lot of viral videos, people grabbing things to resell. And the narrative is sort of that that's just happening, that's been happening at length without consequence. And I know that, of course, it's hard to generalize because every case is unique and different facts and a different person committing the crime. But how typical were those kinds of cases in San Francisco? Um, the high profile smash and grab versus what was the average shoplifting case that you saw?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rachel, for the question and for bringing us all together to discuss such an important and timely topic as always. First of all, we all saw those videos. So we know that those kinds of smash and grabs, the high profile, the picture that we can all see in our mind, that occurs. But it doesn't occur nearly as frequently as what social psychologists refer to as the selection bias or the availability heuristic might suggest, because that's what we see, and therefore that's what we think happens. But the reality, in terms of what we saw in the district attorney's office, the cases coming in, the police reports, was very, very different. Those high-profile cases were an outlier. They were not the norm by a long shot. Obviously, they were important, they were significant, they were scary, and we had to respond, and we did. But in terms of the day in, day out issue, it was very, very different. And I should say, first of all, that when it comes to the way that the San Francisco Police Department and many police departments across the country keep track of statistics. For our purposes, under California law, one of the biggest single contributors to the statistical category, larceny theft, was actually car break-ins. So it's totally different than shoplifting. And it's hard to parse when you look at San Francisco police data, what is car break-ins, technically a auto burglary, under California law, and what is a more traditional shoplift or commercial burglary, because they get lumped in to the same reporting data category. But in terms of the actual shoplifting we saw, it was much more common to see people who were unhoused and highly unorganized, but selling their products through centralized fencing operations. And so the initiative that we took when I was district attorney was to try and work our way downstream in the flow of stolen goods and dismantle the operations that were buying large volumes and reselling large volumes of stolen goods. And the reason that we did that is we saw that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for police to respond quickly and effectively to every reported shoplift. You have maybe a group of kids who go into Nordstrom's and leave without paying, or you have someone who's has a substance use disorder who goes into a Walgreens and steals deodorant or shampoo. Very difficult for police to triage those kind of calls and respond quickly enough to make an arrest on scene. And I hope we get to talk about this later, but historically, loss prevention in these stores would have made the initial arrest. That has changed a lot in the past several years or decade. And a result is that very, very few, approximately 1% to 2% of reported thefts in San Francisco during my administration resulted in an arrest. We simply couldn't prosecute cases, no matter what the category of theft it was, if police didn't bring us an arrest. And so we started taking our own initiatives, building out operations where we could track the flow of stolen goods through stolen good commerce and identify people who were moving literally millions of dollars of stolen goods rather than waiting in vain for police to be able to respond and bring us cases in the lower level kind of frontline cases. I should also just note, and I'll end on this, but when we think about this problem of shoplifting, really important problem, just important to put it in context and kind of comparative scale. Far more in terms of dollar value is stolen by employers through wage theft every year, and far more is stolen by employees from their employers in terms of shrinkage internally than is lost in terms of these kind of high profile smash and grabs, just to put it in context.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chase. I think that's a really important context because we see all of these headlines that really lead to the sense that these are the most common and most costly crimes. So, Kim, I want to ask you as well, sort of as we see this discourse, all of these headlines that have continued to focus on these crimes for quite some time now. I'm curious from your perspective as chief prosecutor for 2 terms. What did you see? Did you see these theft offenses actually increase, or was it a perception increase? And if so, what was driving that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's always a pleasure to be with Chesa and my other panelists today. Listen, I think the issue of retail theft is nothing new, that people have been stealing from retailers for as long as we've had retailers. I think what we saw in the course of the last 10 years or so with, the accessibility of videos on camera, particularly related to smash and grabs, as you mentioned in the introduction, the lawlessness that one sees, the imagery of people literally running around and grabbing things, and shoppers who are there, trying to handle their own business, being afraid. Those are very scary images. I would agree with Chesa that that was not the norm. Those were outlier crimes, but so significant in like how they looked in their appearance, that they drove this conversation that they were happening more widespread. What we were also seeing, in addition to the videos coming out about these isolated incidents, were retailers taking steps across the country to lock up merchandise, to lock up their wares. And so what you were then seeing is, if maybe I didn't see a smash and grab, but I went to go get a bottle of deodorant and it's locked behind a cabinet. In that sense of, well, everywhere I go, if I go in and I'm not able to access products, I am now believing that there is a phenomenon that is happening that is now required for products to be locked away. And like I said, it didn't matter where you went. So as we were dealing with the issue here in Cook County in Chicago, I could go to Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles or New York or anywhere and see the same issues related to products being locked up. So I think the perception certainly was amplified as we saw retailing practices change, and as we also saw that coupled with these videos. And then there was also a narrative that we started to hear happening a lot, that a lot of these major retailers were pulling up stakes in certain neighborhoods. And the reason for the pulling up of the stakes was incidents of retail theft. Now, the issue is that sometimes that narrative didn't match what the actual statistics said. But if I live in a neighborhood where I am dependent on my local pharmacy, um, for my medication, for my prescription, the absence of that store is significant. And so the narrative around the absence of that store, if the narrative is, well, we would keep this for you, but for thieves, then that again creates a psyche amongst people to believe, oh no, it's not that they weren't hitting their profit margins, it's because these places are no longer viable shopping options. And so the data had not borne out that there was this dramatic increase in shoplifting in Cook County. It just hadn't borne that out. But the narrative certainly had shifted. The other thing that I will say specific to Cook County, as you mentioned, and we can get into it in a bit, we did change our threshold for felony prosecution. We were still prosecuting shoplifting, but what we were prosecuting as felonies, we raised the threshold to match what we were seeing, not just in like other big urban areas or state that had urban or states that had big urban areas, but literally our neighbors. Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota all had significantly higher thresholds for felonies than Cook County did. And what we did have and continue to make progress on, but we've got a ways to go, is an issue around violence and gun violence and the like, and wanting to make sure that our resources were addressing those issues. Again, being mindful of holding people accountable for shoplifting, but really trying to balance, what is the appropriate measure and how are we doing that in alignment with our other states. But no, there was no evidence that I saw the data bear out to suggest that there was an increase in retail theft. There was an increase in conversation, but certainly not an increase in the actual commission of those offenses.
Thanks, Kim. There's a lot you mentioned that I want to follow up on. And Mark, I see you unmuting, so I'm sure you want to jump in with some of what data does tell us, because now we've heard from two prosecutors about what they saw. What do you see from a national landscape in terms of the data reflection of how these crimes have been happening over the past few years?
Yeah, and it really amplifies what we've heard already, which our Council on Criminal Justice report back in 2023 found the number of incidents has actually been declining in recent years, but the value of what's stolen has been going up. And one exception was New York, which did have a bump in number of incidents, according to our data. And I've been able to find some preliminary data, at least for 2026 so far, and we actually see that intensifying. So your average amount stolen is $220 now. And for the top 10% of most prolific shoplifters, it's $880. And that's mostly the type of shoplifting rings. We're not talking about a single teenager. And what's really interesting is we're seeing an acceleration in areas like stealing through the cargo. They're falsifying documents. They're hacking into the system that dispatches the trucks to the stores, and so they're actually diverting whole trucks through things like that, and that has a huge impact. And once again, this is really the sophisticated form of shoplifting by criminal rings, and maybe not what the average person thinks of when they think of, a teenager taking a candy bar from a store. And so I think that's really important. The other thing I would say is in terms of the perceptions, we recently put out a report on perceptions of crime, that perceptions alone are really important because there's a chilling effect. People may not go out of their place at night or go shopping because they're worried about crime, even if the data doesn't fully back that up. So perceptions do matter. And I think we do, though, have to recognize there's other forces that have been affecting things like vacant storefronts, the fact that people are getting so many of their things delivered. But that can be a vicious cycle because, of course, if you have vacant storefronts, then you have diminished foot traffic of people who aren't looking to commit crimes, and that creates its own urban problems. So I think the good news is shoplifting incidents continue to fall even through this year. What it does point us to, I think, is the traditional dichotomy was, are we tough or soft on shoplifting? That's not so much the issue. I think it's, are we sophisticated or are we primitive? Because everywhere you look, it's a matter of using technology and collaboration between law enforcement and prosecutors to stay ahead of what are increasingly sophisticated crimes that are driving the biggest loss to retailers.
Thanks, Mark. That's really important way to frame it, I think. And Barbara, I want to bring you in with your extensive expertise and also to ask you about something Kim mentioned. She brought up the fact that things are locked up, and I think it ties into what Mark said about the perception and how does going into a store and seeing everything locked up affect perception. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, because you work so closely with retailers, what trends are you seeing, including, when did they start to lock things up and where is this happening? Is it mostly in cities? And what you think is driving some of those changes?
Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me, inviting me to work with these my esteemed panelists here. Um, My head is spinning, as always happens when I get involved in these things, because our organization has been at the center of all of this. We are not prosecutors, we're not retailers, we're not any of these people. We're a nonprofit organization. Our primary purpose is to work with the offenders themselves, the petty low-level offenders, to try to reduce the number of them that are out there in the world. Because statistically, 1 in 11 people in our country um, have a history of lifetime shoplifting. They either currently shoplift, are willing to shoplift, or have shoplifted in their past. So do the math. What's 11%? Excuse me, 9%. 1 in 11 is 9% of, I don't know how, I don't know what the population is now, 330 million ish. It's a lot of people. And getting back to what I don't know if it was Chesa or Kim that said, there's just not enough police to respond to all these incidents. It can't happen. It's mass. Um, what we are seeing and working with retailers and in conversation is an evolution. I think Mark just said it's getting more and more sophisticated. But the question is why? And how did that happen? And that gets back to perception. So I think we've created a perception in this country that shoplifting is okay as long as you don't go beyond a certain level. Um, and so there's been a damaging trend over the last 20 years away from accountability for theft offenders, especially low-level theft offenders. And so it's culminated in this confluence of issues that continue to send these dangerously empowering messages to shoplifters or would-be smash and grab or would-be ORC offenders. I mean, the first time I saw a smash and grab and crowd-sourced event, I stopped and I thought to myself, how on earth did we get to a place where you can post on Facebook, hey, everybody, let's get together and go steal everything in the handbags department at Nordstrom? When did that happen? Again, it's about perception. So over the years, I think that we've been limiting, for good reason, raising felony thresholds. Good reasons to do that. Reducing the number of apprehensions. Good reasons to do that. During COVID, it became quite literally life-threatening to even try to apprehend a petty theft offender because the exchange of air and whatever. So there are just all these things happening, and it has just changed from a manageable external shrink problem for retailers um, to a brazen disregard for the law and a disrespect for the property that doesn't belong to people. And I'm talking about people of every economic strata, from every culture, every community. It's really very universal. Part of my responsibility has been collecting data from every single offender who completes an education program through our organization for 25 years, 26 years this year. And the bottom line is nothing has changed in 26 years, but by a few percentage points. So these people are all the same. It's the same concept. And I think it's just that in our haste to act or our need to act to address, all these other problems, we've removed and eliminated protective factors like police interdiction, arrest, prosecution for every level of offense, which is really the only way to send the right message, but it's not realistic. It's impossible to do that through the system. So basically, in the short answer, Rachel, is that really nothing is new under the sun except this level of sophistication, the level of the ability of our criminal justice system to stretch as far as it needs to handle this. It's not possible. The resources aren't there. And to work as a community. So for years, we've contended that not every petty offender needs to be arrested. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's counterproductive. But they all require some kind of progressive and proportionate accountability. So that's what we study now and are looking at trying to create for retailers and prosecutors to work together. So when we all come together, that's when we're going to be able to maybe start putting a lid on this evolving and growing shoplifting nightmare.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'm curious what others' reaction to what you just said is, particularly around whether it's a more sophisticated marketplace or not in terms of the folks that are stealing, if they've really just developed new tools, or how much of it is about the changing ways of our economy these days. Mark, I'd love to ask you sort of what do you think is driving, what is your reaction, first of all, to what Barbara said? And how much do you think that the world has changed versus, offender behavior changing?
Sure. Well, of course, she alluded to social media, people seeking attention and in all the wrong ways through that. But I think another thing is interesting is the in terms of what she said about standards in a society is that there's some really interesting empirical research that was done in cities in Italy. But what it found when there was local scandals of corruption in government, shoplifting and other similar crimes, property crimes went up substantially. And it's obviously kind of the notion that if everybody else is doing things and cashing in, why should I be the fool who's not cashing in? And so this is, I think, something that's important to think about as well as we try to have, ideally a more ethical society, whether at the top or the middle or the bottom. But, I think one of the things that I've dealt with over the years is the offense thresholds. And, most research that I've looked at suggests most those offending don't plan things out in advance in terms of the statute, the books. But on the other hand, there are examples of where there's these organized groups specifically try to stay under a threshold through multiple incidents. Unfortunately, that's been able to be addressed in multiple jurisdictions recently with changes in law that allow prosecutors to aggregate individual instances across even not just beyond a single jurisdiction from one county to the other. And I think that's helpful. Organized shoplifting laws, which most states, not all states have, are helpful, again, in targeting the rings. So I think that really what we have to do is kind of put the problem in silos and think about what strategies, and Barbara's talked in the past about restorative justice diversion for that, teenage kind of single instance shoplifter, which is at the other end of the more organized spectrum that really accounts for most of the loss. So having multiple strategies is critical, I think.
Yeah, Kim, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to jump in really quickly and everything that Mark said. But in addition, I know when Barb talks about the sophistication of it, there is the sophistication of it on the more elaborate rings. And then there's the ease of it that has happened in the last several years with self-checkout. Like at one point, you would have to like interface with an actual human being, right? When I was a young prosecutor, the cases would come in, someone would have watched the person pass the last point of sale without having purchased the thing and have a receipt and the like. And now what we have seen, what has become sophisticated is the new retailing establishment, which is now people are able to check things out themselves. And so what we've seen, taken apart again or siloing away from the sophisticated rings who are doing the fencing and the like. But when you're talking about the low level offense that Barbara was talking about, it is changed dramatically. So yes, in the last 26 years, Barb says that, much hasn't changed. It actually has. Like the ease by which people can access goods without having to interface with another human being, I think has changed dramatically. And I don't think the numbers have like soared in the way that you would think that they would have soared, given that. But that's a real reality. It's not even just, as Chesa mentioned, low clearance rates on the arrests once they happen. It is really being able to detect in real time what is happening because of the lack of human engagement and interactions. And that has changed. And for whatever reasons that retailers have decided that it is more cost effective to do this, I'm assuming they've counted in their bottom line the cost of theft associated with it. But I just want to be clear that it's not that somehow people have gotten that much more sophisticated, which they have. And Mark alluded to storefronts being closed and online shopping, and when we see the tentacles there, but the straight up old school shoplifting methodology has gotten a lot easier with the increase in self checkout automation, AI, if you will. that has allowed for this to happen. And that is a choice that retailers have made. And I'm not knocking the choice, but I'm saying that that is a significant difference than when I was a young prosecutor in the early 2000s to where we see things today.
That's such a great point, Kim. And I know we have a lot of line prosecutors with us today watching this, and their average case is going to start changing, as you said, if it hasn't already. And particularly with the advent of AI, as you just mentioned, I think we're only going to see less human interaction and in so many things we do. I was just in an airport and watched, robots to bring things in the club to people. And so as we continue to see more and more automated processes, Chase, I want to bring you into this because I know you also sit on the board of the AI and Justice Consortium, and just curious, how much of this is, as Kim was talking about, sort of retailer decisions and other factors that are driving some of this, and how much of it do you think is continuing to change due to AI and advances in technology, and how should that impact how prosecutors think about these offenses?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do want to just emphasize the point Kim made, and I'll kind of pivot from there to the emerging technologies that we're seeing in California and beyond. But, I think it was back in 2023 that the CEO of Best Buy, Corey Berry, came out and said, we've successfully curbed shoplifting and inventory loss by utilizing higher staffing levels, by having security personnel at the door, by having full service checkouts, again, to Kim's point. So these are business decisions, and I don't run a retail enterprise. I've never done that. I don't have any, presumption that I could do it better or that I know best. What I do know, and what Corey Berry has said very, very publicly about Best Buy and its approach, is that there are things that work and they come at a cost. It costs money to pay more staff. It costs money to have somebody greet people at the door. It costs money to have actual employees do the full service checkout. And those costs, on the one hand, could be expensive for a business. On the other hand, they could reduce loss in a different category. So there are trade-offs. The other thing that we saw a lot during the pandemic in San Francisco and during that period when I was in office was we saw kind of a very typical and traditional, as Barbara said, this is a story as old as time about how certain retail industries will expand to gain market share and then contract and close stores to reduce costs. And we saw that especially with Walgreens. It would move into new areas. It would open a new store. It would drive competition with smaller local pharmacies. And then it would push people into their online business, which is more profitable, and close a retail location that it would blame on theft. Rather than just on a business strategy. We looked into some of those incidents where a store was being closed, and people were saying, "Oh, this is about theft, and we're not safe. We can't be profitable." Some of those stores had like 5 or 10 reported incidents over a couple of years, right? That's not what was driving the business decision to close these stores. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, labor relations, different strategies for where you want to incur costs. And also, I think part of it has been a political decision to try to shift some of the burden away from the business that might be historically paying for loss prevention and have the taxpayer start to do more of the work. We saw that in California, and this is, Rachel, going to get to the heart of your question about technology. A couple of years ago, 2023, I think it was, Governor Newsom said he wanted to respond to the political concerns around organized retail theft with, I think it was a $250 million or roughly allocation to local law enforcement, district attorneys, police departments, sheriff's departments, and they accepted grant proposals. The Board of State and Community Corrections came up with a process, reviewed the proposals, and then distributed the money to the successful applicant. Well, most of that money ended up going to develop a network of license plate readers, of automated license plate readers. It's not entirely clear to me what the nexus is, between that technology and organized retail theft. Obviously, there are certain cases where people come and go in cars, and being able to track the movement of those cars can be extremely valuable to law enforcement. But for all the cases where people come in on foot, for example, or where it's not obvious what car they come or go from because it's a big mall or a big complex, it's hard to track them through it. That technology may have other utility for law enforcement, but it's not directly related to a lot of the retail theft that we see. But it's certainly true that as the networks of criminals become more sophisticated and use more technology, it's appropriate for law enforcement to have more technology to combat them. And I think we're seeing that play out all across the country with drones as first responders, with automated license plate readers, with facial recognition software. And all of these technologies have tremendous potential to empower law enforcement to be more effective, more responsive, to avoid wrongful arrests, wrongful convictions, but they also come with risks. And so we're trying to be intentional in the work that we do with our local government agency partners to really think about the cost, the dollar costs of these technologies beyond just the initial contract. Think about the protections that are needed for data privacy, for civil liberties, for compliance with local legislation around issues like reproductive choice or immigrants' rights. And we know that these technologies are not nearly as well tested as we'd like them to be. We want more data. We want a better sense of what the actual impact is on clearance rates, on response times, on successful convictions, et cetera. So I think we're still in a very early period of how these technologies are being used and where they can actually be most effective. And we'll see where that investment leads to in California. I don't think that there's been a huge demonstrated correlation between that investment and changing crime trends. But we've seen a continued push beyond just that investment for more draconian, as Mark said, the kind of old school tough on crime approach without any real data behind it. And we could talk more about this later if we have time, but California just repealed Prop 47 and basically brought back some of the most punitive, lowest thresholds for prosecuting very low dollar value theft as felonies and making people eligible for state prison based on thefts and prior thefts, even if the dollar value is de minimis.
Thanks, Jason. We are going to get to policy responses in just a minute. And I have one more question before we move on to that. And that's for you, Barbara. I want to get some of your reaction to some of what's just been said, because one of the things I think is interesting about your work, as you mentioned, is that you work directly with the people who are stealing. And so from that work, what do you see as the reason that you said sort of the people are continuing to steal and there's people who are, I think you mentioned like sort of lifelong folks who steal. So like what is driving that behavior from your experience? And obviously knowing that there are differences among people, but what is driving recidivism on those kinds of crimes? And from your work, what's effective at changing it? And especially what's effective that prosecutors can think about in their work?
It's a great question, and everything that everybody said, Mark alluded to the need to kind of silo these things and look at ORC as one thing, and then with state laws and so on and so forth, and separate petty shoplifting. Kim's point about things have changed drastically, absolutely, but not from the individuals who shoplift necessarily. The individuals, 70% of them have said they don't plan their theft in advance. So Kim's point is very critical there because if the opportunity is greater, the 70% don't plan it in advance, they see an opportunity, then they act. So Kim brought up self-checkout, all the new ways. I won't mention a very national, huge national chain where I have been in it more than once, where the alarms at the door go off, which cost a fortune. They go off, and the lady at the closest checkout says, "Don't worry about it. It happens all the time." What? I mean, the opportunities are there. So the opportunities have changed. The people, we don't believe they have. And technology too. Chesa pointed out that the police should have greater technology because the offenders do as well. And there are two within shoplifting. There's two kinds of people, right? The people who will. That's actually three kinds of people in our country. People who will never shoplift, no matter how poor, no matter the economic situation, no matter who else is, how crooked the politicians are, however, whatever they perceive is happening in their world, they'll never steal. There are people who will always steal, and those are the people who are going to end up in the ORC silo. And then there's the people who will steal because they can. And those are the people that we believe we can begin to corral. And the question comes, is this a top down or a bottom up issue? Do we start with the biggest, most costly ORC groups, or do we start with the offenders? And I don't think it's an either or. I think we have to do both. And we Why do people steal? Because they can, is the bottom line. That said, there are many, many issues behind that. Columbia University did a study on the prevalence and correlates of mental health and theft and shoplifting. And they found the same thing that we found. 9% of the country, there's a direct correlation between mental health and stealing. We then looked at for what statistics we have from the offenders who say they steal X amount each time they steal, and how many times is this their first time, are they repeat offenders, so on and so forth. And statistically, while the retailers will report that each petty theft runs them somewhere between $150 and $250, we looked at, based on the frequency and volume of their theft, how often they steal and how much they steal, that the average petty offender, misdemeanor offender, is actually worth about $1,870 every time they get caught, because they only get caught 1 in 49 times they steal. And they say they're only prosecuted once in every 100 times they steal. So that adds up to a lot. So, this gets back to the point that my fellow panelists and Rachel have heard me say 1,000 times, that it's going to require a paradigm shift where we work all together, where we all we retailers, prosecutors, police, judges, probation officers are all pulling in one direction, so that our common enemy is not each other. The common enemy is the offender. And I listen to retailers complain about prosecutors, and the police don't come, and the prosecutors won't take the case, and then so I'm not going to apprehend them. Well, that's not productive. That's not helpful. So we kind of have to put that aside. And I would love to see this group really work at finding a way to address those people from the bottom up, The technology, the police, all of those sophisticated things are what we need for the ORC side of this. But we can't ignore the fact that if we keep allowing people to steal, as they grow, as they come up, as they're a juvenile, they're a kid. I got away with it, all the time in high school. Why are they arresting me when I turn 18? They don't even understand why they're getting arrested. So there's an education that has to start at the bottom, with all these petty offenders that right now we're collectively ignoring.
Yeah, I want to turn to some of the prevention in just a minute. And before we do that, I want to follow up on Chesa was talking about some of the changes in California. I know, Kim, you've been very active, and as I mentioned during your bio, in your office changing the approach to what is classified as a misdemeanor versus a felony, which of course has significant implications on what kinds of consequences someone is facing, and even decisions about what should be prosecuted. So, Kim, let me start with you. I know that you have looked carefully at a lot of different states, and what each state approaches as a felony versus a misdemeanor change when it comes to theft, and what are the thresholds for felony theft in Illinois, and how would you like to see that change?
Sure. So the felony level for retail theft in Illinois is $300, and it is one of the lowest in the country. And I look at Mark every time and think about Texas, which is Texas 2,500, Mark.
That's right.
2,500, Wisconsin, 1,000, Minneapolis, or Minnesota, 2,000. We've seen, and I know those numbers seem large, and I'm not making light of the significance of those numbers. But when we are talking about, rise in inflation and the like, again, not what they pass for people to steal, but we're talking about threshold levels that were set in a different economic environment. And we just have to be honest about that part of the conversation. And so for me, when we looked at that policy change, it was a policy change, not a law change. So the law has remained the same. And the current administration is adhering to the stated law as it is. And which is certainly within the realm of the prosecutor's office to decide how to use their resources. Part of the issue that we were seeing, and I want to relate this back to Barb, we were sending people to prison. And I will tell you that the cost associated with that, so to Cheda's point about the shift with taxpayers, we were paying a significant amount of money to incarcerate people for relatively short amounts of time. If you're talking about, a felony retail theft, let's say, and most times, to be clear, we weren't even under the original, state law, most people weren't going to jail or prison for stealing $280 worth of stuff. Like there was a graduated period. And in Illinois, we too have laws that aggregate the amount to allow you to go up to a higher degree of felony. So that exists. But if we looked at the data in terms of who was going to prison, how much time were they spending in prison, and then looking at recidivism rates, what we were seeing, to the point that was made earlier, is it's not even just rhetoric on tough on crime. We were using the heaviest of the tools to be able to address it. And what we were seeing is that it wasn't making the difference that even, Barb is talking about. And so that's the part where we were like, can we be thoughtful about it's not just the number, it's like who are the people, what are the rationales? I hear Barbara, and I've said this, I've been fortunate to be with this group before. When I was in high school, I stole a tube of lipstick. And, I can say it now, the statute of limitations has passed. I feel like I was not the only one in my cohort. I'm not a criminal, I have a criminality, but those are some of the things when we look at, particularly at juvenile, adolescent behavior, to the point of like, what can I get away with? The pushing of bounds, and like, one stop by that law, or that loss prevention person that made me never want to ever be caught again. That was enough for me, right? I didn't need a 3-month program. I need a 3-week program. The call to my mom that said that I had a Maybelline lipstick in my pocket was enough, right? And so I think that we are sophisticated enough to know that there are some people, even in the equation of three, the people who will never steal, the people who are just, they get, songs named for them for being boosters and the like. And then that middle ground that's a little squishy. That it is, yeah, I'm hungry and I see that I can take this extra thing because it's available. And maybe that compromises even some of my own moral character, that I would do this, but I just feel the need. And it's not excusing any of that, but really being thoughtful about, well, what is the proper tool to address it? And so as we talk about the policy issues, whether it's a diversion program, an education program, whether that first, and we see this across the criminal justice spectrum, some people on that first engagement are never going to come back. But our responses have not allowed for that level of nuance, right? And we have so much evidence and data that proves that the most punitive of responses, right, don't get us the outcome that I think we say that we want, which is for people to not do this again. The most punitive of the outcome, and I've seen it. I've seen people with kind of multiple records at once. I might see a long history of drug convictions and a long history of retail theft convictions and maybe some engagement around mental health and the like. Those coexisting issues drive a nice amount of these things that make prosecutors feel like, what do we do here? What is the target, right? If it's we're not addressing substance use disorder that is having people feel like, I'll do anything and everything to be able to feed this habit. That is not a shoplifting issue. That's a substance use disorder issue. So it's not even so much just the silos that are in the space, but it really is, how do we all come together and appreciate the complexity of what feeds retail theft too? Because it is not just stealing for stealing's sake for everybody, and how we then respond. Because I think part of the frustration that retailers are seeing over the course of the last 26 years, to use Barbara's point, I only came in office in 2016, right? So I know a lot of people were like, "Oh, Kim Fox." No, before I got there, we were contending with this issue, and we will continue to contend. But that is because the tools that we have used historically have not netted the results that we say that we want. And we've not been thoughtful enough about how to pull in all of the parties that are necessary to say, no, we don't want people to steal, but sending people to prison for these amounts, not ignoring low levels, but now I have nothing to lose. I'm a convict. My opportunities to be able to be employed, to be able to do the things that make me provide in the legal economy have now been shut down. And so now that I'm shut down from the legal economy, I have no incentive to play by some of the rules that we would like for people to play by. So, what is the thoughtful response to that?
Thanks, Kim. And I want to turn in just a second to some of those thoughtful responses and innovations. Before we do that, you brought up Texas, and it is interesting because I think there's such a popular narrative that it is blue states and blue cities that have these, high tolerance for theft, and you hear that in Illinois the threshold was so low for making something a felony, and then in Texas you have a quite high threshold comparatively. So how did that come to be, Mark, as our resident Texan? And how has or has this not impacted the level of theft rates? In other words, is there a correlation between the threshold and what we see on the ground in terms of level or number of offenses of related to theft?
Well, to answer your question, there hasn't been a study, I think, since Texas changed, but I think, established the number of incidents in terms of shoplifting has gone down in both in Texas and nationally, but the value's gone up. But to the other question, how that happened, I was very intimately involved with it. At that time, I was at Right on Crime, and we were working with a senator named Connie Burton, a Tea Party state senator at the time, and the $500 felony theft threshold that Texas previously had not been adjusted for ever, or at least for many decades, not in my lifetime. And so the obviously going from 500 to 2,500 was a pretty big change. Um, Part of the way that it got through was it did pass the House separately, and then it was attached as an amendment to a larger bill that Senator Burton had that did a lot of other things like giving priority to civil suits involving children who had been abused. The bill had other things in it that obviously if it had been vetoed would have been lost as well. But one point I want to make is that part of what happened in California is after realignment, there were a lot of public statements and that was, of course, the policy that converted lower level felonies as to being issues for counties to pay for and to deal with state jail. Now they got money from the state for that to deal with in county jail or otherwise. And so after that realignment policy passed, a lot of sheriffs and some district attorneys, but I'm mainly talking about police and sheriffs. They said, look, it's not worth our time. And actually, probably district attorneys were pushing back on them, but they said it's not worth our time to arrest people for something that's now a misdemeanor because they're probably not going to be incarcerated. Now in Texas, I can tell you, if commit misdemeanors, Class A misdemeanors up to a year in jail, Class B is up to 6 months. But I mean, more than that, nobody's out there saying we're not going to enforce this in law enforcement after we raise that threshold. So I think in California, that type of rhetoric may have contributed to the idea. And again, I can't prove this, but that on the part of offenders that, well, now nobody's watching. As Barbara said, 1 in 48 is what we're solving nationally with shoplifting. And so that's a number I think all of us want to increase a lot. And, just little things like we talked about the self-checkout earlier, the picture of what you're scanning or you should be scanning shows up on the screen. That helps. But, other technologies, facial recognition is obviously very controversial, but if we, obviously in the private sector, if somebody's choosing to go to that store knowing that that's a question, knowing that their face may be scanned by cameras. I think it's a pretty strong deterrent if Walmart knows that, whether they reported it to the police, and most shoplifting isn't reported to the police by retailers, which is another question, but that may be because the expectation of a real strong response isn't there. But if Walmart has somebody that they've identified as a frequent shoplifter at Walmart, and now they're not going to be able to shop at Walmart anymore because some buzzer goes off if they re-enter again. I'm not saying the technology is there or it's accurate enough yet, because we know there's been issues, including racial issues with mistakes and facial recognition, but that's something we need to think about because there's potential for a deterrent effect without even, frankly, government being involved or expending more resources. That certainly again gets back to how do we match the sophistication of the shoplifting rings that we're up against.
Thanks, Mark. I know we have some good questions in the chat coming up, and before we get to those, I want to talk a little bit about what works and some innovations that prosecutors can implement. And Chesa, you brought up earlier in our conversation the role of clearance rates and that these crimes are solved at such low levels by police. We also know, and you taught me this, that the most effective deterrent to crime is the likelihood of being caught, not the length of sentence. So I'm wondering, given that, how can prosecutors address this challenge when they don't have control over who's caught? And how can they either deter, prevent, or address these crimes, given the fact that, as a lot of you have mentioned, the police are really the ones that have the power in many ways to, the police and the stores, to deter these kinds of crimes to begin with?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rachel. I'm going to put a link in the chat for everybody to see, which is it's a little bit old, but it summarizes great research on deterrence, and it's 2016 kind of summary from the National Institute of Justice. And the number one finding is that the certainty of being caught is vastly more powerful as a deterrent than the punishment. And what that tells us is we can tinker with the $2,500 threshold, or California from 1982 until 2014 had a $400 threshold, wasn't adjusted for inflation. Prop 47 gets passed, it goes up to 950. And listening to many people, you would have thought the sky had fallen, and this was the end of civilization, and we just essentially repealed that last year. None of that stuff really matters in comparison with the certainty of being caught. And that's true whether we're talking about being caught by loss prevention officers who are private security employed by the stores, which is what basically every single shoplifting case that got prosecuted looked like when I started practicing. Or whether it's police responding in real time because they have unlimited resources, and we've multiplied by 500 the number of police officers on the street, and they can have somebody positioned outside every single store in the city. So I do want to actually take that opportunity to respond to one of the questions I saw in the chat that talked about more funding for police. And I would just say, like, we can have a more robust conversation about what level of police staffing and budget is appropriate. But when you're looking at one in, what was it, 1 in 48 reported shopliftings being solved. In San Francisco, in my final year in office, police were solving 2.6% of reported theft cases. So when you're looking at that as a deterrent, it's not very effective. And it just doesn't matter what prosecutors do unless there's something prosecutors can do that motivates police to do their jobs better, right? And maybe there is. This is another question in the chat about, police saying it's just not worth their time. I just want to, first of all, acknowledge and agree that we heard that constantly in California during the kind of Prop 47 era, and in San Francisco during my administration in particular. And I would just say, since when do police get to have a veto on the laws that our legislature passes, or on the policies that our elected officials choose to implement or campaign on? If what it takes for police to be motivated to do the job we're paying them to do is to be able to pick and choose which punishments are adequate, or which crimes are worth their paperwork, then I think we've moved away from democracy. That's just not what democracy looks like. That's what police states look like. And so I don't say that to be critical of individual officers who might be frustrated with the amount of paperwork involved, or with what they feel or perceive as a limited or inadequate response. I say that as someone deeply committed to the rule of law and to having armed forces who are paid by the state to enforce the law, not to choose what it is or which laws to selectively enforce. So I think that's just a really critical bright line rule in terms of how we run free and democratic societies, even if and when there are real problems. I don't blame police for having lower clearance rates for theft than they do for murder and rape. I want them to prioritize murder and rape and violent crimes. I think it'd be great to see all of those clearance rates go up. And I think we should collectively be committed more to that certainty of detection and capture than we should be to finding ways to ratchet up punishment on the back end for the very small percentage of people who are in fact caught by police. So I think that's just something to be aware of as we think about what we can do. Prosecutors, I do think, have a role in motivating police, and this is maybe indirect, but I will say one of the lessons I learned from my time in office is that police shouldn't but do effectively have a veto. And if we can't find ways to motivate them, then we have a political problem. And that's just the reality we live in. I don't know that that's how it should be, but I think that's how it is. And so helping police to understand the reasons why we implement the policies we implement, helping them to appreciate the benefits of restoring trust between impacted communities and law enforcement, helping police understand why in some instances an arrest without any prosecution is in fact the single most effective intervention that research shows us we can have. In other cases, we need to have a more severe intervention. We need to have a proportional escalating response, as Barbara's talked about, for people with prior arrest. But if police don't understand why a first time arrestee is more likely to commit crimes if you prosecute them than if you don't prosecute them, then they're going to feel disappointed that they wasted their time, quote unquote, that they did the paperwork, right? When in reality, those of us that are immersed in the research know a low-level first-time shoplift offense is less likely to repeat if you arrest them and do nothing or do a diversion program than if you send them to one of Barbara's courses, than if you put them in jail, right? That jail is more destabilizing, more disruptive, more traumatic, and more criminogenic for that category of offender. If police don't understand and appreciate that research, then yeah, they're going to be frustrated and they might be less likely to do their job. I want to get to some other questions in the chat, but Rachel, I'll let you and your team walk us through those, unless there's something else you wanted me to hit on first.
No, before we get to those, and by all means, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I was seeing them all, and we will get to them in just a few minutes. But I want to give Barbara a chance to follow up or respond to what Chesa just said, particularly around what you've seen works. Chesa alluded to some of the programs that you're involved in and some of the interventions that you've seen be effective with folks who are shoplifting. Can you tell us about them and what lessons prosecutors can take from those successes?
Yeah, so our programs have been in use, like I said, since 1989. Our organization was founded by a retail executive, a loss prevention executive, who couldn't reconcile the reports he was reading in front of him and the person sitting across the desk from him. And so when he retired, much to his wife's chagrin, he took his retirement savings and started a nonprofit organization. And its goal was to figure out why people do what they do, but more importantly, to help the people themselves understand why they do what they do so they can address why they do what they do and stop. Because shoplifting is not making anybody's life easier. They think it is maybe in the short term, but in the long term, absolutely is not. For sure, the certainty of arrest, of being caught, absolutely, 100%, 80%. Let me just check this statistic. Yes, 80% of the offenders who've been through our program, which is a couple million, say the decision to steal again was based on their experience the time before. So if they were picked up by a retailer and then they held them for the legal hour they're allowed to hold them, and nobody from the police showed up, what did I just learn? If I have that point of view. And then it goes on. And then the prosecutors don't take the case or whatever it is. But we're never going to, agree on what the right answer is, because everybody has their own priorities, their own goals, and they're all correct. But to Chase's point of view, we don't really have the right to decide. Retailers don't have the right to decide why or when the police come. The police don't have the right to decide why or when the prosecutors prosecute something. The judges don't have the right to decide, and so on and so forth. So what we have to look at is what happens next, right? So it's what happens at apprehension is the first step. And I think the thing that we as an organization, who again sits in the middle, we don't have any agenda other than reducing shoplifting in the US. That's our mission as a nonprofit, is a stepped approach. So it's progressive prosecution, we call it. But it's not really progressive prosecution. It's progressing to prosecution. So the first time you steal, the first time you're caught, the prosecutor's office empowers the retailers, because this is the cooperation that's necessary, to offer education at apprehension rather than calling the police or doing whatever the next thing is, and acknowledging that the retailer has done that. Then if there's a record of that, and that shoplifter comes back and steals again, then the second time the police are called. And maybe they get, again, another education program through a police diversion. From our perspective, that would be ideal. Because one of the things offenders tell us, and I don't know if it was Kim or Chesa who said it, but um, a petty shoplifter gets put in jail for 3 days, even the county jail for 3 days. They sit there and they don't think about what they did wrong. They think about, why am I in jail when everybody else gets away with it? And they think about the unfairness of the punishment, their perception of that unfairness, as opposed to the fact that they did something wrong that needed correction. So we try to not use the word punishment. We try to use the word accountability because it's just more effective for people. Don't punish me, I'm an adult. But accountability is accountability, right? You can act however you want because we have that freedom to do that in this country, not illegal things, but we can say things, whatever. The point is, there's still accountability. That's the bottom line. So again, we're progressing now. An offender gets to the police, maybe they get offered an education, a diversion with education, but that's their second chance at education and self-regulation, because that's what we really need them to do. We need them to self-regulate, to stop and say, wait a minute, I need to make changes. And then the third time they reoffend, essentially, it's the third, we gave you 2 opportunities to examine, to self-regulate. Now we have to look at why you're continuing to do this, and now you have to face charges. And there's advantages to this as well, because if we're offering education at apprehension, we think there needs to be community accountability. So, for example, we could take a community value. We could take this opportunity to make it a force multiplier for police. So the retailer has to call the police department and simply say, I have Rachel M., whatever, in my custody. Does she qualify? That's it. Because you don't want the person to hear, oh, or the police are coming. Does she qualify? And that gives the police an opportunity to say, do I have an outstanding warrant for Rachel? Because if I do, this retailer's already got her in custody. I got to go and pick her up because I could pick her up for this and the outstanding warrant. So there are things that if we're creative in our thinking on this, which we haven't done yet, we believe that we could get a program whereby we're not only reducing the number of people who shoplift, you're reducing the number of people who are out in your community on outstanding warrants, and then you're able to separate and aim your resources at the right offenders, the thresholds, the felony thresholds, and so on and so forth. And I just want to throw one thing in there about felony thresholds from the retailer's point of view. And I'm not agreeing with this, I'm just telling you what it is. It's usually that nobody will prosecute anything that's not a felony. So once you raise your felony threshold, then all misdemeanors and all shoplifting goes out the window. It's not correct, but that's the perception, because perception's reality, right?
Thank you, Barbara. And I know we have questions, so I promise we're going to get to them in just a second. I just wanted to ask him because as you hear, as a lot of prosecutors on this hear a lot of this, there's elected prosecutors who might say, look, like, I get this. I get why this is not a good use of resources to prosecute these low-level folks in punitive ways. There's also a lot of pressure from the business community, from the media. And then at the same time, there's also line prosecutors who may have bosses that are just like, here's your caseload of misdemeanor theft or felony theft. Go prosecute. I don't want to hear you say that like this isn't worth your time. So like what advice do you give to both the electeds and line prosecutors on how to navigate this reality and do justice, which is of course their job?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I think the theme that you also keep hearing is limited amount of resources and big needs. And so I don't care if you're in a big county like Cook or a small rural county, you have a limited amount of resources and a tremendous amount of need to have to contend with. And so if I'm an elected official, certainly I have to look at how am I prioritizing the resources that we have. We have in Cook a nice robust misdemeanor unit, that's what they do, whether it's a misdemeanor shoplifting offense or a misdemeanor battery or the like. We have lots of misdemeanor cases in which we are required to show up on behalf of our victims. And I want to be responsive to the fact that retail organizations who are being stolen from are also victims. And so we want to be responsive. I think one of the things that we have to be thoughtful about is engaging in those conversations, working in partnership. It is why I thoroughly enjoy these conversations with Barbara and having that retailer perspective there to hear and understand the frustration that we have about the limitation of our resources, but also the frustration that they have about feeling that their needs aren't met and what are the ways that we could work collaboratively. I think a lot of times in these policy discussions, and, I saw it when I was in leadership, it was just, we just are going to be opposed. And it wasn't to suggest that the $1,000 threshold would somehow solve for the limitation of resources that we had. We still had to deal with them on the misdemeanor side. But it was also, as the elected official, you've got the 30,000-foot view of this, right? I know oftentimes when we talk to our victims, they see it from their vantage point was at that point in time. I have the benefit or had the benefit of looking at the entire trajectory of the system, from that arrest to that prosecution to that sentencing to possibly to what the accountability or punishment look like. And then to be able to look and trace that same person over time. And so having that vantage point, I think, allows for us to be more thoughtful in terms of our policy approach because it's not just rote. It's like, what are our outcomes? How are we changing the numbers as Barbara sees them with the policies that we have in place? If the threshold is $100, but we're still seeing no change in the level of thefts that are happening because people are not getting caught, right? So that part of the conversation, if you're not getting arrested, the certainty of arrest, the threshold to the point that was made earlier doesn't matter. And so I think we really have to, as elected officials, be really thoughtful about what does the research say? What does the data say? What do the people who are impacted by the crime, so the retailers and the business community, say? How do they understand how we do our work and how do we work collectively and collaboratively together? I think that piece is missing, truly. And I think for a lot of these things, again, as we started this conversation, you show me a smash and grab, I see the things tied up. It becomes very politicized that, people are letting lawlessness and recklessness happen and not the nuanced conversation of like what's really happening here. And so I think that that's work that elected officials have to do. And it's tough work because everyone wants to feel responsive and there's no pithy way to say, hey, the felony threshold may not give you the desire that you want because and I saw the question in the chat, so I'll pivot to that for a moment too. We did see a lot of times, I had a lot of calls where retailers were calling me saying that the police weren't making an arrest because they didn't think anything was going to happen, even for levels that were felony threshold levels. And that's a hard thing to battle against when you don't even have a say in what's happening on the ground. So there's work to be done there. The other thing, and I saw a question related to this too, and we talked about it a little bit last week, Rachel, that loss prevention experts or officers, that dynamic has changed. Some retailers had the ability to send people to come to court. And it's not, it for our prosecutors on the phone here or on the line here, it's sitting and waiting for maybe someone's going to get a supervision or a diversion or a probation, and that person's on the clock. That LPO is still on the clock for the person for whom they work, and they're spending time in a courthouse waiting for all these cases to go while there's still work that needs to be done at the retailer. So oftentimes we do see that calculus being made of I'd rather have someone here versus sitting around in a long drawn out court process. Or for our smaller retailers who don't have access to large security firms or loss prevention experts, our smaller mom and pop stores that also can't afford to have someone out for hours on end at court. So what are the things that we can do to work together? And I will say, as I talk about this collaboration piece, there was really good work being done with the state's attorney's office, and I'm sure that continues, state's attorney's office, the attorney general's office, and the business community here in Cook to look at what the data says, to be able to parse out, all right, these are different people who are organized rings. These are people who are part of some larger international ring. These like being able to do that um, allows us to allocate those resources differently. For the line prosecutors who are on the line, like that, this is our job. Our job is to prosecute offenses. What that means, what that looks like, I think is having some flexibility, trying to get an understanding of what it is that we're contending with, not being rote in our response. So even if you have to try this case as a felony case, at the $300 level, like looking and saying, well, what's the outcome that we want to see here? Is it necessarily prison? Is there some type of program that we can contend with? Not no one's saying don't do your jobs. I think we just have to be more creative in terms of what is the outcome we're trying to get. You not stealing from that store again, you appreciating that you should not be stealing at all and held accountable for that, and doing it in a way that does not create a circumstance that is more destabilizing, that is not, as doctors say, first do no harm. I think a lot of times that we've not been thoughtful enough in our practices to see whether our response is actually helpful or harmful. And those are the kinds of conversations that I think line prosecutors should be thinking about in every case that they handle, whether it's a drug case or a retail theft case. What is the outcome I'm trying to get? It's not simply the conviction. These are easy convictions to get. Once that arrest is made, it's not a who done it here. These are not like highly complicated cases. They're rather simple. It's what are we doing once we got them? And if we know those recidivism rates are high, asking the questions of why and what's the intervention that makes the most sense.
Thanks so much, Kim. I want to turn to some of the questions in the chat. I know some have been answered in writing, and I'll try to go through these too. But Mark, this is probably a good question for you and maybe Barbara as well. The House recently passed Corca, which purports to address sophisticated retail theft like cargo theft by allowing federal prosecutors to aggregate values and establish an intelligence center within DHS, a huge surveillance giveaway to an out-of-control agency. Do you have any thoughts on this bill or response?
Well, there's a number of different provisions in it, and it's in the Senate now. But one of them does deal with something we talked about earlier, which is aggregating. And in this case, it says to meet the $5,000 threshold, they can use any incident anywhere across the country for a 12-month period to go after a network. I'm not sure how much difference it'll make, but I mean, it certainly is of a piece with the type of things I think all of us think makes sense in terms of going after a large network. I mean, federal prosecution is obviously quite limited in this area. And to answer another question about stolen credit cards, in that particular area, only 8% of people who have their cards stolen report it because the banks, of course, whether, you know, when you have a credit card, they make you whole for the charges. So there's not much incentive for the person who was victimized to pursue things. Yeah, I think in the case of the legislation, some of the provisions kind of go beyond things we've talked about today, like civil asset forfeiture, which raises a lot of questions for many of us. But I think in terms of enabling incidents to be combined when we're doing a network, I don't think we're going to see a flood of federal prosecutions because federal resources are so limited. But certainly there can be those cases where those incidents where might be in multiple states are really the tip of the iceberg. And so they may not have enough evidence for, you know, there may be many more that they did in a particular state that we just don't know about. So being able to combine a few from a different state does, I think, make prosecutors' job a bit easier.
Barbara, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think that look, all these kind of efforts are critical. I do want to echo what Mark said. I think that it's going to be very difficult to try to aggregate things across states as if on a federal level. I mean, we have trouble doing it within a jurisdiction to get to a felony. That said, I don't want to say that we should not be passing additional laws. I think every resource that we can put in the hands of our prosecutors is critical, our police and prosecutors. So resources are great. My only negative to that would be that we have an awful lot of laws on the books right now that we could be using in a better way to accomplish possibly the same goal. Looking at really better enforcing laws we have in conjunction with this effort would be something I think our organization believes is important to do.
Thank you, Barbara. I wanted to mention too, there was a long conversation in the Q&A about restorative justice from a former prosecutor with 12 years of experience talking about using restorative justice techniques in shoplifting cases. And I'm trying to summarize this long question, but this person said that they remain unaware that any defendants who participated in restorative justice returning to the criminal justice system in that jurisdiction, and wondering if any panel members had different experiences or hold a different viewing of restorative justice. Chase, I saw that you wrote back saying you had very similar experience where you saw robust randomized controlled studies over multiple years that reinforced the use of restorative justice and saw much higher victim satisfaction when restorative justice was used. Wondering if anyone else wants to weigh in on that as well.
Our organization works with prosecutors across the country in their restorative justice programs. And restorative justice is a fabulous tool. I think it's one of the underutilized tools that we have already. Um, I think I can't speak for each individual restorative justice program. You can go to shopliftingprevention.org and look up our recidivism studies on our program. I can tell you King County, Washington found that our juvenile program not only was a good deterrent for shoplifting, but they said, and I quote, the approach and content within the YES program, which is our juvenile program, is highly effective in preventing future shoplifting offenses, as well as other types of crimes committed by juveniles. And I would guess that most restorative justice programs have that same experience because, again, it's accountability as opposed to it's perceived less as punishment and more as accountability because there's a cooperative nature to it. In this case, the gentleman, or whoever put this in, said that they bring in the retail loss prevention people as well as um, the person who committed that crime. So there's a conversation right there. So restorative justice is very valuable, and that's why that's the root of what we think we should be doing cooperatively with the progressive approach to that, because the problem with this is you have to get all the way to that prosecutor's office. So Mark, you're a statistical person. And there's also a question about a statement about how only 15% of retailers are reporting theft, or 15% of theft gets reported. My point is, I don't think enough people who could benefit from restorative justice get that far in the system to benefit from restorative justice. So if we could bring restorative justice to the beginning, we believe that would be a very valuable effort.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I just wanted to mention one other thing because Kim referenced it earlier, substance abuse disorder. I don't think we perhaps talked enough about the role of drugs. And 30% of people that are in state prisons in the U.S. for property crimes say they stole to get money for drugs. And I think that there may be things we can look at. Obviously, a lot of times the only way for people to access treatment, unfortunately, is once they get into the criminal justice system. And one of the areas that I think we do have could look at is drug courts, for example, to say, make sure you don't limit your jurisdiction to people that just have drug possession. Make sure somebody who has repeat shoplifting, even if it's felonies, but if it's to feed a habit, that they're eligible to get into that drug court. So we're not just, it's not about low-hanging fruit. It's about people that really have an addiction that we can stop property crime by addressing through that type of a court, just as we can address, drug possession obviously is its own matter, but when you talk about property crime, that's what really affects more the whole community.
Thank you, Mark. Before we close out, we only have about 3 minutes left. I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to weigh in on sort of a takeaway you'd like everyone here to take away, and especially highlighting any sort of alternative approach that you would like folks to consider, whether that's through a policy, whether that's through a practice that a prosecutor can implement, any changes you'd like to see in 30 seconds or less. I can start with you, Kim.
Yeah, I think I said it already. I think that we have to be thoughtful about each case that comes before our docket to see, to Mark's point, going back to, what are we dealing with here? I think our assumptions about who the shoplifter is requires us to do some digging around, actually, who are they? Is this a person who poses a threat, or is this a person who is going to repeatedly do this? changes the trajectory of how we pursue that case. And so, what I would say to any prosecutor, your number one superpower is your discretion. And it isn't to say that you should not, hold people accountable. It really is to think about the long term, not just the conviction, what happens thereafter. If there are restorative justice programs or diversion programs or partnerships with the retail community that can be established to allow for you to send people there, I will wholeheartedly think about doing that. But first and foremost, for any line prosecutor, look at the facts of your case, look at who your defendant is, and what is the outcome that you're hoping to achieve that goes beyond the conviction. Again, these are easy convictions once they come into court. These are not really super difficult cases. The question becomes what is the appropriate response to that? And talk to seasoned lawyers in your office. Again, talk to people who've worked in these areas to be more nuanced and thoughtful in that response.
Thank you, Kim. Mark, I'll turn to you next.
Well, I'll just point to a program, the Seattle High Utilizer Initiative, which I think does embody a lot of the components we talked about today, including the drug treatment point I mentioned earlier, and it's had a 57% reduction in high utilizer referrals. And it also embodies the collaboration point of bringing police, treatment professionals, prosecutors, retailers, everybody together to try to solve the problem, and obviously starting with those who are causing the biggest share of it.
Thanks so much, Mark. Chesa.
I just want to thank you and your team, Rachel, for bringing us all together for a great conversation. And I'll just echo what my fellow panelists have said and really emphasize just paying attention to data and what works. I think too often when we're on the front lines handling large volumes of cases, we kind of just put one foot in front of the other and do the same thing over and over again. And not all defendants, not all cases are created equally. And there's a lot of really good data that is often disconnected from what the day-to-day practices are in most criminal courts. And so I'd encourage folks to kind of zoom out a little bit when you can, look at the research, look at the data, and try to, as Kim said, use that superpower you have as a prosecutor to connect the dots between what social scientists and criminologists around the world know to work or not to work and what you're actually doing case by case.
Thanks, Chesa. And last but not least, Barbara, I wanted to give you the last word.
Yeah, I think that again, thank you for bringing this together. I think this kind of collaboration is critical. And all I can say is after this 26 years of listening to everybody's particular pain points and every level of stakeholder involved in this, including thousands of conversations with individual shoplifters who have gone through our programs, my takeaway is still the same, that if we have any hope of solving this and getting a handle on putting a lid on this rising tide of shoplifting, we all have to band together to do that. And it's going to take some jurisdiction somewhere to go out on a limb and test this. An elected official, even a state, it might have to be a state AG that gets involved and says, in my state, this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to test that and see if it works. And honestly, I think we could be testing a model that could work to reduce a lot of issues that we struggle with, which is not enough police to handle all these offenders, not enough loss prevention people in the stores to handle it. How is self-checkout affecting this, and so on and so forth down the line. There are so many things that we could be addressing if we just open that box and take restorative justice from the last intervention in the process to the first.
Thank you so much to all of you for this conversation. I know we have a lot more that we haven't gotten to, but I appreciate all of your insight. This has been recorded, and we will post it on our website in the next few days. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. And you can sign up at prosecution.org to make sure you're kept informed of all of our events. But thank you to our esteemed panelists for your wisdom and insight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.